My name is Danny Howerin. I am 36 years old. I work as a dedicated hospice nurse. And exactly 4 weeks after giving birth to my daughter, I finally managed to buy the home I had dreamed of my entire life. It was a quiet, sturdy place, a sanctuary where I intended to heal and build a life with my newborn. On the very first night in that house, while the moving boxes were still heavily taped shut, my mother called me. There was no warmth in her voice. No congratulations on the milestone. No asking about the baby. Just a cold, commanding statement. "We're moving in tomorrow," she announced over the phone. "I don't do rules for my grandchild. Your sister's family is coming, too. If you don't like it, you can leave." Leave. Leave my own house. The house with my name legally on the deed. I was being ordered out by the very woman who had always patronizingly called me good with the dying. I didn't argue with her. I didn't cry. I simply took a breath and said, "Okay, Mom, come at noon." What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her own mother, the woman she had publicly declared too far gone to know anyone, was resting quietly in the bedroom just down the hall. And she wasn't gone at all. The next day, they aggressively barged through my front door, fully intending to take over my home and my life. But instead, they froze in the doorway, every single one of them. I am going to tell you exactly who was waiting for them in that living room, and how a woman my family had essentially buried while she was still breathing ended up holding all of them accountable in one single room. But if you have ever been the person in your family that nobody listened to, the designated helper, the afterthought, the one who overthinks everything, please stay with me. I am telling this story for you. And please, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I like knowing who is in the room with me. Let me take you back to the beginning. The phone screen went dark in my hand, and the kitchen fell completely quiet, the specific, hollow kind of quiet that only a brand new house can have. There were no familiar creaks in the floorboards that I had learned yet. There was no ghost of anyone else's life trapped in the fresh drywall. All around me sat the heavy cardboard boxes I hadn't yet found the energy to open. My daughter's name was spelled out in thick black marker on 3 of them. Maeve. Down the hallway, a white noise sound machine pushed a soft, rhythmic static under a closed nursery door. And under another closed door, there was a completely different kind of quiet. I slowly set my mother's voice and my phone down on the counter. Then I reached deep into the pocket of my wool cardigan and pulled out a small, creased business card I had been secretly carrying around for 5 long months. I didn't even need to read it. I knew the name and the number printed on it by heart. I just turned it face up on the nearest taped box and stared at it until my racing pulse finally came back down out of my ears. "Okay, Mom," I had told her. "Come at noon." Noon was the hour that would finally show them exactly who I had become. In my family dynamic, I was universally cast as the helper. That was the unpaid, unappreciated role I was abruptly handed before I was even old enough to read, and absolutely nobody ever bothered to ask if I wanted it. My older sister, Stephanie, was the golden child. She got the lavish wedding with 200 guests and a husband who obnoxiously introduced himself by casually mentioning his investment returns. I, on the other hand, got the apron. Stephanie had married Trevor Maddox, a slick, polished wealth manager who could make an entire dinner table go respectfully silent just by mentioning his spotless professional record. Somewhere along the way, Trevor had also quietly, seamlessly become the man who managed my elderly grandmother's finances. My father, Gary, governed the family the exact same way he governed everything else in his life. From behind a ceramic coffee mug, which he conveniently lifted to his mouth whenever a hard, uncomfortable question came near. He was like a man constantly checking the depth of water he had absolutely no intention of ever entering. And my mother, Carol, directed the entire family performance. She was the kind of woman who flawlessly organized the church potluck, wept loudly and visibly at other people's funerals, and made sure to tell the entire room exactly how much money and time she gave to charity. To me, however, she only ever gave a job. The last formal family dinner I ever attended willingly, perfectly encapsulated this. She physically handed me a massive stack of dirty plates the exact second I walked through the front door. Across the dining room table, Trevor was loudly explaining compound interest to my father, who nodded along enthusiastically at every financial word he clearly didn't understand. I carried the heavy plates to the kitchen. When I came back out to the dining room, my mother reached out and lightly touched my wrist with 2 fingers. It was the exact gesture you would use when petting a stray dog you weren't entirely sure about. "You're just so incredibly good with the dying deer," she said, projecting her voice and smiling so the whole room could hear her maternal praise. Not everyone is cut out for more complex things. Trevor let out a short, dismissive laugh without even bothering to look up from his meal. "Leave the complex numbers to the people who actually understand them, Danny," he chuckled. I quietly stacked the next set of dirty plates. I didn't say out loud that I had personally held the trembling hands of more people through their terrifying last hour on Earth than anyone at that arrogant table would ever meet in a lifetime. I didn't say that being good with the dying was the single kindest, most accidental truth my manipulative mother had ever spoken. I just quietly cleared the table, because that was exactly what the designated helper did. And the helper had learned a very long time ago that arguing with them only agonizingly extended the meal. They genuinely thought the apron I wore meant I was inherently soft. They thought the brand new house, the newborn baby, and the plastic hospital bracelet still strapped to my wrist meant I was finally small, vulnerable, and exhausted enough to easily push around. They truly thought the house made me weak. The very first time I truly understood that being needed and being genuinely loved were not the same thing, I was 10 years old. I was standing alone at the front bay window, watching the family station wagon slowly back down the driveway, completely without me. It was the middle of summer. There was a large, packed cooler shoved in the trunk, my sister Stephanie's bright pink suitcase proudly strapped to the roof, and my father sitting at the steering wheel checking his rear view mirror for traffic. And there was me, standing forlornly in the doorway, tightly holding a handwritten list of my grandmother's daily medications. My grandmother had caught a severe case of the flu, and somebody responsible had to stay behind to nurse her. My mother had simply rolled down the passenger window as they pulled away. She didn't look guilty or sad to leave me behind. She looked intensely proud of me, which was somehow infinitely worse. "You don't need a summer vacation, Danny," she called out brightly. "You're the responsible one." The car turned the corner and disappeared. The house went incredibly still. I remember the sound of the kitchen clock much more vividly than I remember crying that day. That flat, plastic tick-tick-tick, ticking away as slow as a dripping faucet, while a heavy blanket that smelled distinctly of menthol rub and my grandmother's talcum powder sat folded over the back of the living room couch. I learned a devastating lesson at that window, a lesson that took me 25 agonizing years to finally unlearn. I learned that providing care could be used as a punishment. But I didn't spend that summer week entirely alone. Down the hall, propped up comfortably on 3 pillows with a cardboard box of saltines and the TV guide, was my grandmother, Ruth Calloway. And when she inevitably heard me crying softly in the kitchen, she called me into her room. She gently patted the edge of the mattress until I sat down beside her. She took my small hand in hers and squeezed it exactly 3 times. Slow, deliberate. 1, 2, 3. It was a secret code we had shared since I was very small. I couldn't even remember when I had first learned it. It meant, "I see you." It meant, "I am here." Ruth was the one who originally taught me exactly how to read a person. Not their spoken words, but their hands, their breathing patterns, and the specific way they got uncomfortably quiet right before they finally got honest. She had been a registered nurse herself, back before it was a profession the women in our rigid family were aggressively encouraged to grow out of. When I eventually told her at 19 years old that I wanted to pursue a career in hospice work, my mother had sneered, "Why on earth would you willingly choose something so depressing?" But my grandmother just gently folded my fingers into a tight fist around the idea. "You actually see people, Danny," Ruth told me fiercely. "Don't ever let them tell you that is a small thing. When I was 12 years old, she took me 3 doors down the street to sit with an elderly neighbor named Mr. Petrosky. He was dying of something incredibly slow in a back bedroom that smelled perpetually of strong liniment and burnt toast. I was terrified of him at first. Ruth didn't tell me not to be scared. She simply sat me down on a hard, wooden chair right by his bed and instructed me to watch his hands, to watch his labored breathing, to watch the specific way his eyes darted toward the window whenever the severe pain hit, so he wouldn't have to wear the agony on his face for his wife to see. "Words lie, Danny," she whispered to me. "Hands don't." We faithfully went back to that house every single afternoon for 2 weeks. The day he finally passed away, his grieving wife held my grandmother tightly in the kitchen, crying onto her shoulder. And Ruth held her right back, as steady and unmoving as a deeply rooted fence post. In that moment, I understood for the very first time that there was a profound kind of strength that looked exactly like softness from the outside. I firmly decided on that hard, wooden chair exactly what I wanted to be with my life. My mother would later dramatically call it morbid. My grandmother called it a calling, and she was the absolute only person who ever used my own word back to me without visibly flinching. She kept her own daily pills in a bright blue, plastic weekly organizer resting on her sunny windowsill, meticulously lined up Sunday to Saturday, every single dose strictly accounted for in her own steady, reliable hand. She used to tap the plastic lid and say, "A human body is just a schedule you have to keep." For the vast majority of my life, that blue pill box sat undisturbed in that exact window, and I never, not once, thought about whose hands it might someday violently end up in. Ruth was the only person in that entire performative family who ever looked at me and genuinely saw a complex person, instead of just a convenient pair of working hands. She was the only one who ever truly saw me at all. I found out I was pregnant on a humid Tuesday afternoon in July, standing entirely alone in a sterile clinic bathroom, gripping the cold edge of the porcelain sink. The man I genuinely thought I was building a future with did not stay. I will tell you the absolute entirety of his involvement in 2 short sentences, because that is all the breath he deserves. He told me he wasn't ready to be a father, and then he explicitly proved it by walking out the door. After that day, the other side of my bed stayed perfectly made, day after agonizing day. Eventually, I stopped noticing the empty space the same way you stop noticing a tooth that has already been pulled. Only the tongue keeps blindly searching for it. I worked my grueling 12-hour hospice shifts. I came home to a painfully quiet, empty apartment and ate dinner standing at the kitchen counter. I felt the very first fluttering kick of my daughter while stopped at a red light, utterly alone, with absolutely no one sitting in the passenger seat whose hand I could grab in excitement. I bought the wooden crib entirely by myself and put it together backwards twice, crying on the floor. There is a highly specific, agonizing kind of loneliness in building a nursery in total silence, awkwardly hauling the heavy cardboard boxes up a narrow apartment stairwell, while pitying strangers briefly hold the door open for you. And I absolutely won't pretend I didn't sit on the floor of that half-finished room one night, with a tiny screwdriver resting in my lap, crying until the Swedish instruction manual blurred completely out of focus. But I also won't pretend it broke me, either. Somewhere deep in those solitary months, I permanently stopped waiting for anyone to arrive and magically arrange my life for me. I officially broke the news to my family at a mandatory Sunday dinner. I had nervously practiced the delivery in my car rearview mirror beforehand. I said it as plainly as possible. "I'm pregnant. It's just going to be me raising the baby, and I am completely okay with that." My mother dramatically set down her silver fork. For one pathetic, fleeting second, I actually let myself hope for a maternal reaction. "Well, that's nice, dear," Carol said blandly, completely dismissing me. She immediately turned to my sister. "Stephanie is entirely redoing her kitchen. Did you hear they chose imported quartz countertops?" The dinner conversation moved swiftly on without me, exactly like a fast-moving river effortlessly flowing around a useless rock. and somewhere hidden under the dining table, my hand found my own stomach and stayed, firmly pressed there. Because if absolutely no one in that crowded room was going to be glad about this child's existence, then I would simply have to be glad enough for the both of us. I made myself a silent, unbreakable promise that night, driving back to my apartment with the car radio completely off. I would build my own family this time around, a real one, completely on my own terms. I didn't know yet that 2 miles across town, my beloved grandmother was already slowly, terrifyingly disappearing. And I certainly didn't know that the smiling people sitting at that dinner table were the exact ones aggressively holding the eraser. It happened the exact way these tragic things always happen, incredibly slowly and then all at once, and with absolutely everyone smiling through it. Over the better part of a year, my grandmother went from being just a little forgetful to not quite herself, to being completely, terrifyingly too far gone to know anyone. And the family enthusiastically narrated her mental decline like professional sports casters calling a game. My mother started every single phone call to me with a heavy, dramatic sigh and the exact words, "I am just so incredibly exhausted caring for Mother." And Trevor, patient, reasonable, financially successful Trevor, smoothly stepped in to help the exact way he helped with everything, which is to say he took complete control of the wheel. "Someone responsible has to actively manage her accounts. Carol," he said smoothly at a family lunch I had been invited to solely so I could watch a cousin's screaming toddler while the adults talked. Trevor had a rich leather folder open on the dining table, financial papers fanned out, an expensive fountain pen uncapped and ready. "She simply can't keep track of the numbers anymore. It's a kindness to take the burden off her." I spoke up, asking the absolute only medical question that mattered. I asked who Ruth's primary doctor was, what their exact diagnosis had been, and whether anyone had definitively ruled out anything medically reversible, like a severe UTI or vitamin deficiency. My mother snapped her head toward me, looking at me the exact way you look at a foolish child who has interrupted a serious adult conversation. "You just focus on holding the baby, Danny," Trevor said, flashing his perfect, white teeth, casually capping his pen. "We've got Ruth completely handled." That bright blue pill box wasn't sitting on her sunny windowsill anymore. It was now buried deep in my mother's designer purse, and she was the exclusive one filling it every week. Handled is a very strange, clinical word to use about a beloved family member. I saw exactly what they meant by handled at my grandmother's 90th birthday party. My mother threw the massive, extravagant party, of course she did. There were dozens of people from the church, nosy neighbors, a massive printed banner, and a massive sheet cake with Ruth's face terrifyingly printed on it in edible frosting. Carol moved gracefully through the crowded room, receiving sympathy exactly like a hostess receiving expensive gifts, one hand pressed dramatically to her chest, eagerly telling anyone who would listen what a horrific, exhausting journey it had been for her. She immediately sent me to the hot kitchen to refill the massive pitchers of lemonade. The helper always refills the lemonade. And right in the absolute center of all that chaotic noise sat my grandmother. She was strapped into a medical wheelchair she physically did not need. She was slumped heavily to one side, her chin resting near her chest, her eyes moving as slow and thick as syrup. A well-meaning neighbor leaned down closely to wish her a happy birthday, and Ruth blankly called the woman by my long-dead grandfather's sister's name. Everyone in the vicinity laughed gently, murmuring, "Bless her heart, bless her." My mother dabbed her dry eyes with a napkin and eagerly accepted a comforting hand on her shoulder from the pastor's wife. "It's the hardest thing in the world," Carol told her, projecting her voice loud enough to carry across the room. "Watching your own mother slip away." Around the room, people nodded solemnly, the exact way people nod at a brave, suffering widow. And I watched my mother eagerly collect that nodding sympathy like shiny gold coins. Near the massive cake, Trevor stood casually holding a paper plate, telling my father in a low, incredibly soothing voice that the estate side of things was all being professionally, legally handled. Absolutely nothing to worry about. And my father simply lifted his plastic cup and drank deeply, accepting the lie. I had spent 13 years in hospice care, intimately learning the stark, medical difference between a human body that is naturally leaving the world and a human body that has been aggressively made to leave. The longer I watched that crowded, noisy room, the colder my blood got, because not one single person in that room was actually looking at the suffering woman in the chair. They were all exclusively looking at the theatrical performance about her. I slowly crossed the room holding a plastic cup of lemonade. I crouched down directly in front of her wheelchair and watched her frail, wrinkled hand tremble violently around the plastic cup. I physically felt the floor tilt underneath my feet, because the woman strapped in that chair was not organically sick the way they kept claiming she was. I had sat quietly with the dying for 13 long years. I knew exactly what the natural, gentle end of a long, 90-year life looked like. This absolutely didn't look like a natural ending. This looked exactly like a chemical dose. My mother caught my eye from across the crowded room. She raised her glass of wine and happily mouthed the exact words for the crowd that she had eagerly spoken into 100 microphones of attention that day. I'd do anything for my mother. I went home to my apartment that night and absolutely couldn't sleep. And so I started doing the exact thing I do best. I started watching. And the terrifying pattern, once I finally saw it, I couldn't ever unsee. My grandmother was remarkably at her absolute worst on the specific days that strategically mattered. Before a scheduled doctor's appointment, before anyone official came to the house with legal papers to sign, before anything that required a coherent signature. On ordinary, quiet afternoons, the ones nobody officially scheduled, she could sometimes follow an entire, complex conversation. It made absolutely zero medical sense. Genuine dementia doesn't check a calendar to decide when to flare up. I cornered Brenda about it. Brenda Castle was the exhausted home aide who sat with Ruth on the grueling weekday shifts. Brenda had the specific kind of bone-deep tired that working-class people get, the kind of tired that makes you incredibly careful about what you say. She didn't quite look me in the eye. She's easier to manage on some days, Brenda said evasively. Then she heard how guilty she sounded and quickly reached for a dirty dish rag instead of meeting my eyes. I really shouldn't say anything more. Why? I kept frantically asking myself on the dark drive home. Why on earth would a person chemically fog on a strict schedule? The horrifying answer was sitting inside a small plastic box the width of my hand. And it was Brenda's incredibly bad luck and my grandmother's miraculous good luck that I was the one who finally, desperately opened it. It all came down to a minor, accidental fall. My grandmother slipped slightly while getting out of bed one cool September morning. She cracked her hip, just enough to land her in the local hospital for a few days. While there, she picked up a minor urinary tract infection, exactly the way the elderly frequently do in hospitals, and she came home needing real intensive nursing, complex wound care, strict medication management, the whole exhausting, relentless machinery of recovery. And my mother, who was already so very exhausted, who had loudly proclaimed anything for my mother into every available microphone, took one single look at the astronomical financial cost of hiring round-the-clock medical professionals, and conveniently remembered she had a daughter who did this exact job for free. So I packed a bag and moved into Ruth's house for a while. And on the very first night, I sat down at the wooden kitchen table with all of my grandmother's current medication bottles spread out in front of me, intending to set up her weekly pill organizer the exact way I had expertly done for 100 hospice patients. And I read the pharmacy labels. I read them twice. My breath hitched in my throat. There was a heavy dose of a benzodiazepine, supposedly prescribed for agitation. At a staggering dose, I wouldn't willingly give a woman half her age. And there was a powerful anticholinergic stacked right on top of it. It was the exact kind of lethal, mind-altering chemical combination that is printed in bold, screaming red letters on every single geriatric warning list in existence. The kind of toxic cocktail any trained nurse, any basic pharmacist, anyone who had spent 10 minutes working around elderly patients would instantly know turns a sharp, functioning mind into a drooling fog. Two heavy drugs that absolutely do not belong in the same week, let alone in the same fragile body, let alone in a 90-year-old woman, given together, given daily, given, I would soon horrifyingly learn, a little bit early on the specific days company came over to visit. I aggressively read the two prescription labels back and forth, as if I were desperately hoping the black text would magically rearrange itself into something innocent. They didn't. I knew these dangerous drugs the exact way a master carpenter knows a warped, rotten board. I had watched this exact, horrific pairing turn perfectly lucid, functioning patients into terrified people who couldn't find their own bathroom door. I had aggressively argued with doctors in hallways to get my patients taken off it. There are long, boring, life-saving medical protocols that exist for one singular reason: to keep this exact chemical combination far away from a fragile body like my grandmother's. Someone had purposefully put it there anyway. Someone had maliciously kept it there, authorizing refill after endless refill, while the family stood in front of the congregation and tearfully told the church what a tragic journey it had been. My hands went completely still over the blue plastic pill organizer. The quiet kitchen suddenly got very loud and very, very far away at the exact same time. This wasn't medicine for a mind that was naturally slipping away. This was a chemical leash. I did not rip the plastic pillbox apart, nor did I call anyone screaming, because I did what my 13 years of grueling hospice training told me to do, which turned out to be the exact same thing my grandmother had taught me at that front window when I was just 10 years old. I watched, I went incredibly slow, and I meticulously made a plan, starting by calling a trusted geriatrician, not the compromised family doctor who had been blindly signing off on my mother's toxic requests, but my own colleague, a brilliant, compassionate man named Dr. Whitman, whom I had trusted for years with my most vulnerable hospice patients, and I laid the horrifying situation out for him over the phone, drug by drug, milligram by milligram, detailing the exact lethal cocktail someone had deliberately prescribed to a fragile 90-year-old woman, leading to a heavy, terrified silence on the other end of the line before Dr. Whitman simply ordered me to bring her into his clinic immediately and to strictly keep my personal notes locked away. We began the agonizing, delicate process of tapering her off the two worst psychotropic drugs over the next stretch of days, doing it incredibly carefully the way you have to with an elderly, fragile body so that the brutal chemical withdrawal doesn't hurt worse than the poison itself. And then I simply sat by her bedside and waited, watching my beloved grandmother slowly come back from wherever they had forcefully sent her. A miraculous resurrection that took about 2 agonizing weeks. The very first sign of her returning mind was incredibly small, but profound. She looked at me from her pillows and asked for tea, not in the vague, confused, shuffling way of the last year, but specifically requesting the loose-leaf Earl Grey, insisting on exactly 2 bags and telling me to let it sit and steep properly. Then, one quiet afternoon, she looked at the faded, silver-framed photograph resting on her nightstand and flawlessly named every single person in it, including the golden retriever we had owned back in 1991, before looking up at me, staring intently at my visibly pregnant belly, her whole face transforming and lighting up like a dusty window suddenly catching the brilliant afternoon sun, asking me when this beautiful miracle had happened and why nobody had bothered to tell her, a question that forced me to set the teacup down on the saucer with a clatter and put my hand flat against the wooden doorframe just to steady myself, because there are some emotional weights in this world that you simply cannot carry while standing up. Dr. Whitman ran his comprehensive cognitive tests a few days later, stepping out into the sterile clinic hallway shaking his head, not at her condition, but at the sheer, malicious absurdity of her previous chart, explicitly confirming that there was absolutely nothing organically wrong with this woman's brilliant mind that 2 heavy, conflicting prescriptions weren't actively causing. And he almost smiled as he told me that I had the absolute best set of clinical eyes this old woman had ever had in her corner. In those 2 triumphant weeks, I watched my grandmother come back to herself the way the ocean tide comes back in relentless, powerful reaches, starting to sharply correct the way I brewed her tea, stubbornly doing the Sunday crossword puzzle in dark blue pen again the way she always had, fiercely daring the newspaper to prove her wrong, and one deeply emotional evening, she asked me to bring down the old, dusty shoebox of family photographs from the top shelf of the hall closet, sorting. Threw them on her patchwork quilt, naming and naming, laughing breathlessly at a faded picture of herself at 20 years old in a silk dress she swore had cost her an entire week's pay, until she found a crinkled Polaroid of my late grandfather, going completely quiet and holding it flat against her chest for a long, sacred while as I sat beside her, never rushing her grief. She told me she had been utterly terrified over the last year, explaining that for a long, dark time she had felt herself violently going under, losing precious words right in the middle of her own sentences, looking at her own kitchen and not knowing which drawer held the silver spoons, and that the absolute worst, most devastating part of the nightmare was that she had genuinely believed she was losing her mind because everyone she loved and trusted kept gently, patronizingly confirming that, yes, she was slipping away, that yes, it was finally time to let other people make the decisions for her, confessing that she had been quietly getting ready to disappear, politely just because they had told her it was her time to go. The worst, most heartbreaking part of the entire ordeal was the morning my grandmother, fully herself now, sat at the kitchen table holding her coffee mug and asked me very quietly, with tears welling in her sharp eyes, what had actually been happening to her, asking, "Where did I go, sweetheart?" Because she had been trapped, fully awake, but paralyzed, underneath that chemical fog the entire time. An admission that I had to sit with for one full, agonizing day before I let myself officially name what had been done to her, because naming it changed absolutely everything about my reality. The forgetfulness, the sudden mental fog, the humiliating slumping at her own 90th birthday party. It all had a strict calendar. It had a highly managed schedule, and things with schedules always have deliberate authors, shattering the lie I had believed for my whole life that my family simply disliked me, revealing a truth that was infinitely colder, simpler, and much more terrifying. They didn't hate me. They just desperately needed me not to look too closely at the mechanics of their lives. If my grandmother's mental decline had been a conscious, orchestrated decision, then so was absolutely everything they had legally done while she couldn't speak for herself, making me wonder with a sickening dread, what if the decline wasn't a natural tragedy at all, but rather a calculated, malicious financial decision, prompting me to open my notebook, turn to a fresh page, and start writing down a name that belonged to Brenda Castle, the home aide, because the first thing I learned about doing this the right way is that you don't go in like an aggressive avalanche, but rather you go in gently to people who are far more frightened than you are. I brought Brenda a hot coffee, looking her directly in the eyes and telling her she wasn't in any trouble, assuring her with total sincerity that I knew she had been deliberately put in an impossible, terrifying spot as a working-class woman, simply following the wealthy family's strict medical instructions in the family's house, and that absolutely nothing that happened next was going to land on her shoulders, which caused Brenda to slowly, shakily reach into her worn canvas bag and take out a cheap spiral notebook with a dark coffee ring on the cover, whispering that she had kept it just in case someone ever asked. It was a meticulous, detailed log containing dates, times, and specific doses, tracking every single pill she had ever administered in her own handwriting, because Brenda had been a certified nursing assistant long enough to know that the person who writes the facts down is the person who is legally covered. And there, scrawled in the margins of certain highly specific days, were the chilling notes she had been explicitly told by my mother to follow. Give the evening dose early on visit days, or keep her calm before the appointment, proving the premeditation of the abuse. Brenda's voice dropped to a terrified whisper as she confessed that there was one specific afternoon where they had brought in a massive stack of legal papers and a notary public, shaking her head as she described how my grandmother hadn't even known the day of the week, repeatedly asking if it was Christmas while Brenda stood paralyzed, admitting that she had almost said something to the notary that day, but my mother had been standing right there glaring at her, and she desperately needed the hourly wages, so she stayed silent while they kept calling it just paperwork to make things easier for Grandma. She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with a desperate kind of begging, swearing that she wasn't a bad person, that she had written it all down because some deep moral part of her knew it was wrong. She just hadn't known who she was supposed to give the evidence to. So I placed my hand firmly over both of hers and promised her that she had just given it to the exact right person, asking her what specific documents Ruth had signed, which Brenda didn't know, but which I fully uncovered by the end of that week because once you finally know what financial crimes you're looking for, paper always leaves a massive, undeniable trail. Someone had maliciously had my grandmother sign away her entire life while she was chemically incapacitated, and I found the fraudulent documents the exact way a surgeon finds a hidden tumor, by feeling around for the thing that absolutely isn't supposed to be there, uncovering a comprehensive power of attorney granting Trevor Maddox total unmitigated control over my grandmother's personal affairs dated the previous spring, alongside a massive transfer of her robust investment accounts directly into high-risk vehicles he personally managed, revealing underneath it all a quiet, incredibly ugly arithmetic of money slowly leaving her name. It wasn't drained all at once, but rather stolen in strategic pieces. Management fees here, portfolio reallocations there, creating a slow, deliberate financial bleed that added up, when I finally crunched the numbers late at night, to a staggering $412,000, completely draining the savings and the home equity she had spent 50 hardworking years building. Stolen in increments from a woman who couldn't have told you what year it was on the day she signed it all. Away, while her beautiful, paid-off house with the windowsill where the blue pillbox used to live was officially listed on the real estate market for a rapid sale. I sat down at her kitchen table, the exact same table where she had fed me as a child, and laid the printed pages out in a neat row the exact way I had laid out her pills, reading them in sequential order. The power of attorney, the illicit account transfers, the real estate listing agreement, reading them twice to ensure I wasn't losing my own mind, and by the second time, I noticed that my own breathing had gone remarkably slow and even the exact way it does at a dying patient's bedside when there is absolutely nothing left to do but be steady. I wasn't shaking, which frightened me just a little bit, realizing how unnervingly calm I was, possessing the lethal, calculating calm of a triage nurse who has finally figured out exactly what venom is actively killing the patient, understanding with crystal clarity that she had signed everything away on a day she couldn't even name, prompting me to stand in my grandmother's kitchen holding a printed bank statement as my whole body went freezing cold, finally understanding that this was no longer a petty domestic dispute about whether my family loved me, but rather a criminal conspiracy about a 90-year-old woman, her stolen home, for $100,000 and a smug wealth manager with a spotless record and a leather folder. I knew I desperately needed someone who understood the complex legal numbers. So I found someone who did, an incredibly sharp elder law attorney named Joan Petrillo, who wore reading glasses pushed up into her thick gray hair and spoke with a voice that sounded like a heavy closing door, sitting across her polished desk with my fully lucid, impeccably dressed, and quietly furious grandmother beside me, while Joan listened to the entire, horrifying story without interrupting a single time. When I finished, Joan took off her glasses and turned to my grandmother first, a profound gesture of respect that I have never forgotten, asking her directly, "Mrs. Calloway, are you of sound mind today? And do you officially wish to revoke the power of attorney you previously signed?" To which my grandmother firmly replied, "I am, and I absolutely do," prompting Joan to slide a single, powerful legal document across the desk, which my grandmother signed with a real, steady signature, legally, revoking absolutely everything they had taken from her with her own competent hand. Joan then looked at me, laying out her battle plan the way a mechanic lays out heavy tools, explaining that we were revoking the power of attorney immediately, moving to legally void the financial transfers because any document signed by someone lacking mental capacity isn't worth the paper it is printed on, filing an emergency notice that would freeze the pending house sale ice cold, and reporting the entire grand theft to the specific state authorities whose entire job is to prosecute this exact kind of elder abuse, folding her glasses into her palm and delivering the hardest instruction of all. Here's the part you'll find incredibly hard because you are a hospice nurse and you naturally want to fix things out in the open. Joan warned me. You do not confront them yet. You build the trap quietly, and then you let the paper do all the talking. I looked over at my grandmother to see how she was processing this intense legal talk of fraud, capacity, and her own forged name on stolen documents. But Ruth Calloway was sitting straighter than she had in an entire year, both of her hands folded elegantly on her pocketbook, her chin perfectly level, channeling the fierce woman who had been a registered nurse for 40 years before the world decided women like her should retire quietly into the background, knowing exactly what it meant to take a careful patient history and let the cold facts do the indicting. Do absolutely all of it, my grandmother commanded Joan in the exact, authoritative voice she used to use on arrogant doctors who tried to talk down to her on the ward. I have plenty of time to be angry later, but right now, I'd like to be incredibly useful. We built the trap quietly, letting the paper talk, but we needed to uncover exactly where the massive sums of stolen money were actually going, which required Joan bringing in a forensic accountant, a meticulous, quiet woman who spoke exclusively in dates and decimal points. And together we followed my grandmother's money the exact way a bloodhound follows a scent to a hidden leak, discovering that while most of it was straightforward theft dressed up as portfolio management, some of it wasn't, going where Trevor had officially claimed it went. There was a hidden, secondary pattern underneath the primary pattern, recurring, unexplainable charges, a second set of highly expensive habits, money peeling off into places that had absolutely nothing to do with my grandmother's medical care and everything to do with someone's secret, illicit other life, leading the accountant to slide a highlighted bank statement across the table, pointing out identical, exorbitant hotel charges occurring twice a month, proving the stolen money was feeding an affair. I confirmed this horrific reality not through clever detective work, but by pure, devastating accident, the way the absolute worst things you learn in life usually are, when my sister Stephanie called me to help her load heavy donation boxes from her garage because Trevor was allegedly traveling for work, prompting me to lift an old winter coat off a hook, only to have a cheap, prepaid burner phone fall out of the inside pocket and hit the concrete floor, lighting up the cracked screen to reveal a highly explicit, romantic text message from another woman. It wasn't just hidden numbers anymore. It was an entire, separate, sordid life, paid for in luxury hotel rooms and expensive gifts, funded entirely, I now understood with sickening clarity, by 90-year-old woman's stolen life savings, leaving me standing perfectly still between two cardboard boxes of donated sweaters, holding a burner phone that belonged to absolutely no good version of anyone, while the garage air went freezing cold around me and I could hear my oblivious sister humming cheerfully in the kitchen upstairs. I silently slid the burner phone back into the coat pocket exactly where it had fallen from, lining the fabric seam up perfectly, hanging the coat back on the hook as if it had never been touched, my stomach dropping clean through the concrete floor as I called out that I suddenly had to get home to my baby, fleeing the house before Stephanie even came downstairs because I simply did not trust what my own face was doing, realizing that Stephanie's marriage was the inevitable next casualty. Because the golden child had been just another gullible mark Trevor had taken from her, 2 in a million small, insidious ways she had never questioned because she had been deeply trained, like all of us in that toxic family, not to ever ask the golden boy about the numbers, leaving me holding a piece of explosive digital evidence that would violently end my sister's perfect suburban marriage. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt absolutely no petty satisfaction in being proven right about her arrogant husband, feeling only a profound, nauseating sickness. Later that week, she happily showed me an expensive diamond necklace he had given her, proudly calling it a thank you gift from a wealthy client, and I held my tongue, absolutely hating myself for holding it, because Joan was right that there was a strict, necessary order to this execution, and detonating my sister's entire life in a dusty garage over donation boxes was not the right time, as Stephanie deserved the brutal truth, told properly and privately by someone who actually loved her, not used as a chaotic weapon and dropped like a grenade. For 30 years, my sister Stephanie had stood confidently on the right side of every single family argument while I was permanently banished to the wrong one. And here was the ultimate receipt that proved I had been right about Trevor all along. Yet I had to forcefully hold it and say absolutely nothing, fighting an old, ugly part of myself that desperately wanted to walk into her immaculate kitchen and watch the bomb land. But I had seen firsthand what it does to a person to be made into someone else's weapon, and I refused to do that to her. There is a massive, fundamental difference between true justice and petty revenge, and the difference lies entirely in exactly who you are willing to blindly wound to get there. So when Stephanie touched the necklace and smiled, saying that Trevor handled all the complex details, so she didn't need to know them, I let her stand on that lie for just a little while longer because I had a master plan and a ticking calendar of my own now, a calendar that suddenly got a terrifying, hard deadline when Joan called me on a gray afternoon. "They've set a closing date for the house," Joan announced over the phone, explaining that they had found a fast cash buyer and were aggressively pushing the sale through, racing to turn the absolute last of Ruth's life into liquid cash before anyone could stop them, giving us exactly 6 weeks until the closing, which made the floor drop out from under me. But Joan simply reached for her pen, noting that the deadline gave us a strict clock and gave them a fatal cliff, as we already had the notice ready to freeze the sale, the capacity assessment from Dr. Whitman, Brenda's notebook, and the money trail. My beautiful daughter came into the world on a freezing cold morning in the middle of March, arriving 8 days early and in an absolute hurry, and the very first hands that ever held her after mine were compassionate labor nurses, as I named her Maeve, spending 3 quiet, isolated days in the maternity ward with just the 2 of us, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the small, impossible, perfect weight of her, while somewhere outside those sterile walls, a real estate closing. Date ticked closer, and my family planned a total takeover they didn't know was actually a steel trap. In that hospital room, looking at her innocent face and the plastic identification bracelet on my wrist, I realized with overwhelming clarity that I had successfully built the exact thing I had promised myself in the car with the radio off so many months ago. A family, a real one, entirely on my own terms, giving me the final surge of adrenaline I needed to close on my own house a couple of weeks later, the small, bright property with the deep windowsills that cost $385,000 and every single ounce of nerve I possessed. I proudly signed my own name on every single page of that property deed myself. As the friendly bank officer slid the heavy papers across a different kind of table, and I signed and signed until my hand physically cramped, feeling how every signature was the exact, triumphant opposite of the fraudulent ones my grandmother had been maliciously tricked into making, because mine were truly mine, and I read every single line of fine print before I signed it, my inner hospice nurse refusing to ever not read the labels again. When the closing was finally done, they handed me a single brass key on a cheap paper ring, and I sat alone in my car in the bank parking lot, holding the key tightly, not driving anywhere for a long while, realizing that just 4 weeks out from giving birth, with my surgical stitches still pulling painfully, I held the key to a house no one had given me and absolutely no one could ever take away, buying myself a heavy front door that I exclusively controlled, which meant I could finally, safely bring my grandmother home with me. Ruth had been secretly living under my roof since the day she miraculously came back to herself, as there was absolutely no version of this reality where I let her go anywhere else, moving her into the sunny bedroom down the hall. And on the very afternoon we arrived, I carefully carried her thriving blue African violet to the new windowsill, setting it exactly where the afternoon light was best, honoring the plant a dying hospice patient had pressed into my hands years ago, telling me to keep. Something alive. My grandmother stood in the doorway of that sunny living room, gently holding my 4-week-old daughter against her shoulder, looking around the safe, quiet room and then at me, squeezing my hand 3 times. 1, 2, 3, whispering softly with her cheek pressed against the baby's head that 3 generations were finally under one roof and they could never, ever take this from us because for the first time in my entire life, the house was undeniably legally ours. What my mother Carol didn't know, what she could not have possibly imagined because she had loudly told the dramatic story of my grandmother's ruined mind so many times to her congregation that she had actually come to believe her own fictional broadcast, was that the elderly woman resting down my hallway was completely awake, fiercely lucid, heavily lawyered, and patiently waiting for the trap to spring, which was the exact state of things on the first night when the moving boxes were still taped shut and the phone rang. "We're moving in tomorrow," my mother had arrogantly announced, telling me to leave my own house if I didn't like it. And as I held the phone in the dark of my new kitchen, I felt the old, pathetic helper's reflex rise up, the ingrained urge to soothe, to fold, to desperately keep the peace at any cost to my own sanity. But I closed my eyes, let the toxic urge pass completely through me and out the other side, thinking of the window when I was 10, the woman drowning in slow motion, the stolen $400,000, an impending closing date. "Okay, Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Come at noon." I hung up the phone and immediately made one short, highly anticipated call to Joan, who answered on the second ring, listening as I told her my mother had just explicitly announced she was coming to my house at noon with the entire family, prompting Joan to stay quiet for exactly one beat before replying, "Well, that's incredibly convenient," because the specific room full of perpetrators we had been patiently waiting for had just arrogantly announced its own arrival, allowing me to make the final arrangements exactly the way a surgeon preps an operating room. Joan would be sitting in the living room with the explosive folder. The Adult Protective Services investigator who had officially opened the elder abuse case, a sturdy, no-nonsense woman named Garrett, was already scheduled to interview my grandmother, and the formal legal notice to freeze the real estate sale, signed and filed by a judge, would be personally served by a process server the exact moment they confidently walked through my front door, prompting me to sit on the edge of my grandmother's bed and tell her she didn't have to perform, prove, or even speak tomorrow. She just had to be awake. The doorbell didn't ring at noon, because entitled people never ring the bell. The front door simply opened on the dot of 12, and they barged in like a violent weather system, my mother leading the charge with a heavy casserole dish in her hands like a victorious flag of conquest, my father shuffling behind her with a thermos, Trevor flashing his easy, arrogant smile with his designer sunglasses still resting on his head, and my sister Stephanie exhaustedly herding her 2 noisy children, and an overnight bag into the foyer. They came in talking loudly, already aggressively arranging my house out loud, my mother's commanding voice carrying ahead of her into rooms she had never even seen, announcing that they would get the nursery sorted first. But the entire parade suddenly stopped dead in its tracks, folding up violently against her back like cars crashing at a sudden red light, because the living room was not empty, and it certainly did not contain a frightened, compliant girl with a baby waiting to be told what to do. My grandmother sat majestically in the plush armchair by the window in the good light, dressed impeccably in her favorite blue blouse, her hair perfectly styled, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Beside her sat Joan Petrillo with a thick, damning folder open on her knees. By the bookcase stood the APS investigator with a silver badge clearly clipped to her jacket, and a man none of them recognized stood near the door holding a thick manila envelope, prompting Ruth to lift her chin, look at my mother with 2 perfectly clear eyes, and say, "Hello, Carol. Sit down." My mother recovered first, the way she always did, desperately reaching for her familiar, patronizing script, forcing a painfully bright smile and declaring that her mother was clearly confused and off her medication, claiming this was all a massive misunderstanding. But Joan didn't even raise her voice. She simply set a stapled medical report on the coffee table and slid it forward 2 inches, introducing it as a capacity assessment dated last fall and again last week, proving Mrs. Calloway was of completely sound mind today and was absolutely of sound mind on the specific day in the spring when the documents were forged. Joan laid the blue pillbox beside the medical report, followed by Brenda's spiral notebook with the coffee ring, meticulously detailing the lethal cocktail of AIDS medication. 2 drugs no one over 80 should ever take together, given daily and early on the days the family visited, prompting Trevor to step in smoothly with his hands open, displaying his professional charm, calling the accusations absurd and claiming she signed the financial transfers willingly. But Joan simply slid the next folder forward, stating that on the exact day she allegedly signed willingly, 3 separate witnesses swore she couldn't even name her own kitchen. Joan laid out the bank statements, the fraudulent power of attorney, and the official revocation signed in Ruth's steady hand, exposing the $412,000 in black and white that had left a 90-year-old woman's accounts and gone somewhere it should never have gone, placing each damning page face up like a tarot card and letting it sit in the suffocating silence, while Trevor desperately tried to spin the narrative, keeping his voice reasonable, using corporate buzzwords like allegations and context, claiming he acted in his client's best interest and that the accounts had performed well. Trevor turned to my father for backup the way he always had. But for the first time in 30 years, my father had absolutely nowhere to put his eyes, staring blankly at the floor, until Joan let Trevor completely finish his frantic spinning before sliding one final, devastating page across the table, slower than the rest, reminding him that as her financial advisor of record, he had a fiduciary duty to her, not to the family, tapping the page once to highlight that the date he moved her retirement accounts into his control was the exact same week she failed her capacity assessment. The APS investigator by the bookcase wrote something down in a small notebook and did not look up, and I watched my mother watch her write it, witnessing the exact horrifying moment Carol finally understood that the woman with the badge was not a polite guest at a domestic family disagreement, but rather a sworn legal witness at a criminal record, prompting my father to set his thermos down on my side table and leave it there, because every single denial they attempted only dug their legal grave infinitely deeper. My mother's face did something I had never seen it do before. The perfect hostess slipped away entirely, and the woman who gave generously to the church, wept performatively at funerals, and loudly proclaimed she would do anything for her mother into every microphone, looked at the damning pages on my coffee table, looked at her own mother sitting upright and clear-eyed in the chair, and the carefully constructed performance cracked straight down the middle, prompting Carol to aggressively snap. She didn't even know what year it was. What does she need a house for? The room went absolutely, terrifyingly silent, not just a stunned silence, but the kind of deafening silence that has a trapdoor dropping out from under it, as my mother heard her own horrific, incriminating words a half-second too late, her hand flying up to cover her mouth in shock. While the investigator by the bookcase wrote the confession down without looking up, Joan didn't move a muscle. Trevor's easy smile vanished completely as he looked frantically toward the front door, and my father stared intensely at his own shoes. My grandmother, Ruth Calloway, 90 years old and full of righteous fury, set her folded hands on the arms of her chair and pushed herself up to standing, looking her daughter dead in the eye and stating in a voice that was even and completely unhurried, "I knew enough to raise you, Carol, and I know enough now," prompting the process server by the door to step forward and hand Trevor the thick envelope, officially announcing that the documents effectively froze the pending house sale cold. My grandmother slowly crossed the tense room to where I stood, taking my hand and squeezing it 3 times. 1, 2, 3, saying my name, and for 30 long years I had desperately waited for someone in that toxic family to defend me, only to realize that I had it backward the whole time. I didn't need defending, I just needed to stop being silent, and the brilliant woman they had maliciously drugged into a wheelchair had just done both for both of us without ever needing to raise her voice. My mother turned to me then, her eyes wet with the fast, manipulative tears she could always summon on command, attempting to flip the script to its very last, desperate page, beginning to sob about everything she had supposedly done for this family. But here is the absolute most important thing I want you to understand, the profound thing it took my entire life to learn. I did not need her to understand my pain anymore. So I didn't explain, I didn't justify, and I didn't list the grievances of my childhood. I looked directly at the woman who had patronizingly called me good with the dying, and I stopped calling her what I had called her since before I could read, stating with quiet, lethal finality, "You are not Mom in this house, Carol. You are the woman who poisoned her own mother for a house, and you are leaving," while Trevor was already frantically gathering his expensive coat and dialing his phone, managing his next crisis, because men like Trevor are never truly standing in the room they're physically standing in. My father stood up slowly, absolutely refusing to look me in the eye, and on his pathetic way out, he stopped in front of my grandmother's empty chair, opened his mouth as if to apologize, found absolutely nothing of substance in it, and walked out the front door with his eyes glued to the floor, leaving my mother as the absolute last one to move, prompting me to walk to the heavy front door, open it wide, and hold it firmly, telling her I was no longer trading my peace with her anymore, and that the door was behind her. I completely stopped needing them to understand my perspective. And if you have ever had to deliver a sentence like that, quiet, definitive, and final, to someone who is biologically supposed to love you and no one in the room clapped for you, and you went to sleep that night shaking from the adrenaline anyway, I want you to know you are not alone. Because I am telling you this, so you understand that you must eventually learn to stop endlessly explaining your boundaries to people committed, to misunderstanding them. The meticulous Folder Joan prepared did the absolute rest of the work exactly the way she promised it would. And in the chaotic weeks that followed, the paper trail went to work in courtrooms and offices I never even had to enter, leading a judge to swiftly void the illicit transfers, declaring that a deed and a power of attorney signed by a woman without mental capacity are worth absolutely nothing, no matter how legitimate the notary stamp looks, meaning the pending house sale didn't just stall, it completely died. The little, paid-off house with the sunny windowsill went legally back into my grandmother's name, where it had always rightfully belonged, while the stolen $412,000 became the subject of a massive, court-ordered restitution mandate with my grandmother's name victoriously on the right side of it for once, and Adult Protective Services officially substantiated the severe elder abuse case, a powerful word that means the legal system looked at the raw evidence, completely agreed with our findings, and wrote it down as absolute fact. And Trevor, the arrogant man with the spotless record who had condescendingly told me to leave the complex numbers to the people who understood them, discovered that because he was a licensed financial advisor and my grandmother had been his formal client, there are entire federal agencies whose only job is to prosecute exactly what he did to her, sending the explosive complaint to the state securities regulator and his firm's strict compliance office, destroying his career. The man who had built his entire arrogant identity on a clean, untouchable reputation watched that reputation violently come apart in the absolute one place he couldn't charm his way out of, leaving his spotless record with a massive, permanent stain they couldn't scrub away, while my mother's social world got suffocatingly smaller in the quiet, brutal way these scandals happen, as the very same church where she had eagerly collected sympathy started returning her calls slower, and then not at all. The financial exploitation of an elderly, vulnerable parent is the rare, unforgivable sin that even the most forgiving, graceful congregation severely struggles to spin positively, and the county attorney's office officially opened a criminal file of its own, a process that moves agonizingly slowly the way the law always does. But it moves relentlessly, meaning no one came to my house in dramatic handcuffs that summer, delivering instead a heavy, permanent paper trail that would walk into every room ahead of my mother and brother-in-law for the rest of their ruined lives. My sister Stephanie came to my front door, completely alone one quiet evening, with no kids, no overnight bag, and her hands completely empty because I had told her the devastating truth by then, privately and gently, the exact way she deserved, sitting at my kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us, showing her every page of evidence, no weapons, just the truth, and she had packed her bags and left Trevor before I even finished my second cup of coffee. Now she stood on my front step, looking 10 years older and somehow infinitely more like the real sister I had known before the fake, golden pain of her marriage went on. her voice cracking as she admitted that I had tried to warn her years ago about him, about all of it, and she had cruelly called me bitter. So I didn't make the moment overly easy for her, but I didn't make it unnecessarily hard either. I just held the door open, a completely different kind of open than the one I had held, for our toxic mother. "We start small," I told my sister, promising nothing more than a foundation, and she nodded tearfully as we didn't hug. We just sat side by side on the concrete step in the cooling evening air. Two grown women who had been raised inside the exact same suffocating lie, and we started small. While it hasn't been perfectly clean since. Some days Stephanie still flinches at the word sorry like it costs her blood. And some days I catch my old reflex trying to manage everyone's feelings. We are healing. We are both actively unlearning the toxic behaviors our mothers spent decades meticulously teaching us. And now Stephanie reads bedtime stories to Maeve. She brings her children to my loud, messy kitchen and the terrible 4-day silences we used to have turned into 4-hour ones, and then eventually into the ordinary, completely forgettable gaps of people who simply have busy, normal lives. While I only see Carol at a massive distance, maybe twice a year in the highly supervised way you keep. A heavy door from slamming without ever opening it. She has never apologized to me, and I have never asked her to. Because I completely stopped needing that closure the afternoon I held my own front door open and realized that forgiveness isn't a door you are obligated to fling open for abusers. Choosing instead to focus on the beautiful summer where the African violet finally bloomed, putting out a vibrant crown of purple in the deep windowsill of a house that was finally, safely and fully ours, while my grandmother sat in the good light with my daughter. Ruth sat with Maeve on her knees and told her the kind of long, looping, beautiful stories that have absolutely no point except love. While Brenda came by sometimes completely off the clock just to visit, and Dr. Whitman dropped in once with a vibrant houseplant as a housewarming gift, and a couple of incredible nurses I had worked with for years filled my kitchen with loud, joyous noise, proving that I had finally stopped waiting to be let back into the broken family I had come from and built. A new one. It was a strange, profoundly good summer where my grandmother taught Brenda's youngest child to play gin rummy at my kitchen table, cheated outrageously, got caught, and didn't care at all, while Maeve learned to grab a tiny fistful of the violet's soft leaves and had to be gently relocated from the windowsill again and again while Ruth narrated her crimes. And Dr. Whitman's housewarming plant turned out to be a massive tomato seedling, which my grandmother declared a personal insult before, aggressively nursing it into a massive harvest. We handed fresh tomatoes over the wooden fences to our new neighbors, finally having enough abundance for once in our lives to give away freely, and Ruth caught me watching all of them one sunny afternoon. 3 generations, a full, loud table, the beautiful light coming in, and I had to turn toward the window for a second because the violet went blurry and I needed the tears to stop until my grandmother squeezed the baby's small foot in time. 1, 2, 3, and told me I had brought her back, declaring she was going to fiercely spoil this child. We grow what others recklessly throw away. And I want to leave you with this final thought because I know some of you listening have been the designated helper, too. My name is Danny Holleran, and for most of my life, other people aggressively held the pen that wrote down exactly who I was supposed to be. The one who cleaned up, the one who wasn't cut out for more, the one who was just good with the dying. But they left a few critical things off that list on purpose, so let me say the whole. Truth now in my own hand. I am a highly trained nurse. I am my beautiful daughter's mother. I am the fierce woman who kept her grandmother's life from being maliciously sold off in pieces. I am the one who always keeps her word, and I am the one who watches everything. And I want you to know that you absolutely do not need their permission to be worth something. You don't need them to clap for you or apologize or finally understand your worth. You only need to permanently stop handing them the pen to write your story because they thought I was just good with the dying, but they completely forgot I was watching the whole time.